There are objects in this world that survive their owners by decades, sometimes by centuries. They carry within them the weight of a life, the imprint of hands that held them, the secrets of moments that should have remained forgotten but demanded to be remembered. This is the story of one such object. A wallet. Leather worn smooth by time, darkened by the oils of countless pockets, edges frayed where fingers had grown accustomed to its shape. On the surface, it seemed unremarkable. The kind of thing you might find in a thrift store, priced at $3, overlooked by most who walked past. But objects are never truly ordinary. They are vessels, containers of narrative. And this wallet, this unassuming piece of leather, held a secret that would rewrite a family's understanding of itself and demand a reckoning with a past that had been carefully, methodically hidden. The wallet was discovered in 1987, nearly 60 years after it had been lost or perhaps deliberately set aside. And estate sale in a small town in upstate New York. A house being cleared after a death, its contents distributed to whoever had the means to claim them. Among boxes of photographs, stacks of letters, and furniture that had outlived its usefulness, there it was. At first glance, someone might have assumed it belonged to the deceased homeowner, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the house for 40 years. But the leather was too worn, the style too dated, the craftsmanship too fine. This wallet had been made in an era when such things were still sewn by hand, when leather was treated with patience and respect. It belonged to an earlier generation. It belonged to a time before Eleanor, to a world that had fundamentally changed between then and now. Where are you calling from? I want to know. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The wallet was purchased by a woman named Margaret. She was a retired archivist, someone who had spent 40 years working with documents, photographs, and objects that held historical significance. She had an eye for detail, a mind trained to see meaning in the margins, to recognize when something ordinary was actually extraordinary. She paid $5 for it, more than the asking price, because something about its weight, its feel, made her curious. She took it home and placed it on her dining room table. For weeks, it sat there. She would pass by it, pick it up, run her fingers over the leather, and set it down again. Margaret was not a sentimental person. She did not believe in intuition or gut feelings. She believed in evidence, in documentation, in the careful accumulation of facts. But she could not shake the feeling that this wallet wanted to be opened, that it had something to say. When she finally examined it properly, using the same methodological approach she had employed throughout her career, Margaret discovered the lining was not original. This was significant. A wallet's lining rarely needed replacement unless something had required protection, unless something had been placed there deliberately, carefully, and then hidden away so thoroughly that it had remained hidden for decades. She used a small tool to carefully separate the lining from the leather. The process took her several hours. She worked slowly, reverently, as if she were excavating an archaeological site. And then, between the leather and the lining, preserved in the darkness and dryness of that hidden space, she found a photograph. It was small, perhaps 3 by 4 inches, and it showed 2 men. They stood close together, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that suggested intimacy, familiarity, a kind of ease that only comes from deep knowing. Both wore the formal dress of the 1930s, pressed suits, ties, hair slicked back in the style of that era. Both were smiling. But it was not the photograph itself that caused Margaret to pause, to set down her tools, to sit back in her chair and breathe carefully. It was the inscription on the back. 3 words, written in handwriting that was careful, deliberate, almost trembling. My heart's truth. Margaret sat in her dining room for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, staring at those 3 words. She understood immediately what she was looking at. This was not a photograph meant for public display. This was not a memento of friendship or professional association. This was evidence of a love that had existed in an era when such love could not be acknowledged, could not be spoken aloud, could not be lived openly. It was a love that had been so dangerous, so transgressive, so threatening to the social order of its time, that it had required this method of preservation. Hidden. Folded. concealed within the lining of a wallet that could be lost or destroyed without raising suspicion. Because if the wallet were found, if someone were to discover it, the worst that could happen was that it would be lost. But if these two men had been discovered together, if their relationship had been exposed, the consequences would have been far more severe. The wallet, then, was not just an object. It was an act of resistance. It was defiance wrapped in leather. Margaret knew she needed to identify the men in the photograph. She began the painstaking work of research. The photograph was dated 1931. The style of dress, the quality of the film, the composition all confirmed this. She searched archives, contacted historical societies, reached out to experts in early 20th century photography. She posted the image in historical forums, asked questions in genealogy groups. The response was slower than she had hoped. 70 years had passed. The men in the photograph could be long dead. Even if they were alive, finding them would be like searching for ghosts. But Margaret was patient. She had spent her career searching for connections between objects and people, between photographs and their subjects. She understood that every photograph was a record, a claim on existence, a statement that said, "I was here, I existed, I mattered." And she believed that these two men had mattered. Their love had mattered. The fact that they had felt it necessary to hide it, to literally fold it into the lining of a wallet and conceal it, was itself evidence of the world they inhabited. A world where such love was not merely discouraged but criminalized. Where being discovered could mean imprisonment, social death, the complete erasure of one's place in society. The breakthrough came 18 months into her research. A woman named Patricia contacted Margaret through a genealogy forum. Patricia had seen the photograph posted there and recognized something in one of the faces. She was 92 years old, and she was looking at a photograph of her uncle. She had never known him, had never met him, but her mother had mentioned him once, in a way that suggested his name was not to be spoken aloud again. Patricia's mother had said only that her brother had moved away, and that, "we don't speak of him." Patricia had accepted this as a child the way children do, without question, without pressing for details. But the photograph sparked something. A memory of hearing whispered conversations. A sense that there was a secret, a wound, something that the family had decided to bury along with the person they no longer acknowledged. Margaret invited Patricia to her home. They sat together, these two women separated by generations, and Margaret showed her the photograph, showed her the inscription. Patricia wept. She was old enough now that she had outlived the people who had imposed the silence. Her mother was dead. Her uncle was certainly dead. Her aunt, who had been her uncle's sister, had passed away 15 years ago. Patricia felt, she said later, as though she was finally able to speak truth about a person who had been erased, forgotten, deliberately removed from the family narrative. Her uncle's name was Robert. He had been a musician. He had been talented, kind, gentle. And he had loved someone. Someone enough to hide their photograph in the lining of a wallet. Someone enough that those 3 words, "my heart's truth," represented perhaps the only acknowledgement he had ever been able to make of his own identity. Together, Margaret and Patricia began the work of identifying the second man in the photograph. This proved even more difficult. The photograph was dated 1931, which meant the men had been together during a specific moment in history. The 1930s were years of economic collapse and depression, years when homosexuality was not merely illegal but actively prosecuted, years when being discovered could result in arrest, imprisonment, institutionalization. The second man's face, though clear in the photograph, yielded few clues. There were no distinctive marks, no obvious identifying features beyond his appearance. Margaret expanded her search. She looked into Robert's life in greater detail, examining where he had lived, what he had done, what might have brought him into contact with someone else who would be significant enough to hide a photograph with the words, "my heart's truth." The research led her to a music conservatory in Boston where Robert had studied. She contacted the conservatory's archives and was invited to visit. What she found there changed everything. Student records from 1929 to 1933 revealed that Robert had studied composition and piano. He had been noted as a talented student, someone with genuine promise. And among the faculty records, among the photographs of instructors and notable visitors, she found a picture of a man named James Whitmore, a visiting conductor from Philadelphia who had come to the conservatory in 1931 to lead a series of master classes. The photograph was dated. The face, even in a formal institutional photograph, was unmistakable. It was the same face from the wallet. James Whitmore. Margaret now had a name for the man whose photograph had been hidden away. What followed was years of careful research. Margaret and Patricia, now working together, tracked James Whitmore's life. He had been born in 1896, the son of a prominent Philadelphia businessman. He had studied music in Europe, had become a respected conductor, had even performed with several major orchestras. His life, by outward appearance, was exactly what would be expected of a man of his class and era. He had never married, which was noted in several biographical entries with what could only be described as a kind of awkward silence. Devoted to his music, one biography stated, "Never took a wife, preferring the company of other musicians and composers," said another. These phrases, when read with knowledge of what had been hidden in Robert's wallet, took on new meaning. They were not simple descriptions of a life. They were euphemisms. Coded language meant to suggest something without saying it directly. Robert had died in 1967. James Whitmore had died in 1981. Both men had gone through life carrying the secret of their photograph, the knowledge of that moment in 1931 when they had allowed themselves to be documented together, to be captured in this way, and then had hidden the evidence so carefully that it had not been discovered for almost 60 years. Margaret found Robert's obituary. It listed his surviving family members but made no mention of any significant relationships, any partnerships, any life beyond what could be acknowledged publicly. She found references to his work as a musician, but his compositions seemed to have largely disappeared from public performance after his death. His life, it seemed, had been constructed carefully around the secret he carried. But Margaret and Patricia were determined that this secret would not remain hidden. They began to compile their findings. They wrote a detailed account of what they had discovered, placing the photograph in its historical context, documenting the lives of the two men whose love had required such concealment. They included the inscription, explained its significance, and argued that the photograph represented something profound about the historical moment in which these men had lived. They submitted their research to historical journals, to LGBTQ archives, to organizations dedicated to preserving forgotten histories. The response was overwhelming. The story of the wallet, the hidden photograph, the 3 words, "My heart's truth," captured something that resonated deeply with people. It was a small story, really. Just 2 men and a photograph and a moment of human connection. But it was also a story about erasure, about the ways history had been written to exclude certain lives, certain loves, certain forms of human being. The photograph, once hidden, is now housed in an archive dedicated to LGBTQ history in New England. Margaret and Patricia created a small exhibition around it, displaying not only the photograph but also the wallet itself, Robert's musical compositions, biographical information about both men, and the research that had led to the identification and contextualization of the image. The exhibition traveled to several universities and cultural institutions. Scholars cited the research in papers about LGBTQ history and the ways in which marginalized identities had been preserved through underground documentation. The 3 words, "My heart's truth," became something of a refrain, a phrase that appeared in academic papers, in articles about hidden histories, in conversations about the courage it took to preserve evidence of one's own existence in a world determined to erase it. But beyond the academic significance, beyond the scholarly impact, the story of the wallet had a more intimate meaning. Patricia, Robert's great-niece, felt that she finally understood her uncle. She understood that his absence from family gatherings, his removal from family photographs, his erasure from the family narrative, had not been because he was ashamed or because he had done something wrong. It was because the world he lived in could not accommodate the truth of who he was. And now, because of a photograph hidden in a wallet, because of Margaret's patience and curiosity, because of Patricia's willingness to speak a truth her family had silenced, that world had expanded just slightly. Robert's life, his love, his truth had been given back to him. The photograph had been returned to visibility. Margaret and Patricia became close friends. They spent years together researching, writing, speaking about what they had discovered. They gave lectures at universities about the importance of preserving hidden histories, about the stories that archives do not tell, about the lives that have been deliberately erased from the historical record. They spoke about the courage it takes to hide something precious, to preserve it in the dark, with the hope that someday it might be found and brought back to light. Margaret, the archivist who had trained herself to see significance in details, to recognize meaning in objects others overlooked, had finally found the story that justified her entire career. And Patricia, who had grown up in a family that had forgotten her uncle, had been given the gift of remembering him, of understanding him, of finally being able to say his name aloud without shame. The wallet itself, worn and fragile, has been carefully preserved. It is displayed now behind glass, a relic of a moment in time when two men dared to allow themselves to be photographed together, knowing that this photograph would have to be hidden. The leather, darkened by time and handling, speaks to decades of protection. The wallet was a guardian. It kept the secret safe. And when it finally gave up its treasure, when the lining was carefully separated from the leather, it released not just a photograph but a declaration of love. 3 words written in trembling handwriting, "My heart's truth." This is what objects carry, if we are patient enough to listen, if we are willing to look beyond the surface, if we understand that history is not just the stories told in books or preserved in official documents. History is also in the margins, in the hidden places, in the spaces between what could be said and what had to be concealed. The story of the wallet is, in many ways, the story of everyone whose love has been deemed unacceptable by the world around them, everyone whose truth has had to be hidden, everyone who has made the choice to preserve evidence of their own existence in the only ways available to them. And it is a story about what happens when that evidence is finally, reverently, brought back to light. When a secret that was hidden for nearly 60 years is acknowledged, contextualized, and given the place in history that it deserves. The wallet, then, is not just a historical artifact. It is a monument to love. It is a testament to the human need to be known, to be seen, to have one's existence validated and preserved. And it is a reminder that history is still being written, that secrets are still waiting to be discovered, that the stories we think have been lost forever might be resting in the lining of an old wallet, waiting patiently for someone like Margaret to find them, and someone like Patricia to help bring them home. But the story of the wallet did not end with its preservation in an archive. Life, as it often does, offered new chapters, unexpected connections, and revelations that even Margaret and Patricia could not have anticipated when they first began their research all those years ago. The photograph, once hidden, had begun to speak in ways that continued to unfold long after it had been brought to light. New letters emerged. Descendants of James Whitmore came forward with family documents they had kept private for generations. And slowly, carefully, a more complete picture began to emerge of what Robert and James had shared, what they had risked, and what their love had meant not just to them but to those who would come after them. Among the papers donated to the archive by Whitmore's distant relatives was a series of letters, carefully preserved, addressed to Robert but never sent. They were drafts, really, letters that James had written in moments of longing or despair, that he had never dared to post because the risk was too great. The postal system was not secure. A letter could be lost, could fall into the wrong hands, could become evidence. So James had written his thoughts, his feelings, his declarations of love, and then he had either destroyed them or hidden them away. But some had survived. And in these letters, James's voice emerged for the first time, speaking directly to Robert, speaking truths that had never been able to be spoken aloud during his lifetime. The letters were dated between 1931 and 1935. They spanned a period of approximately 4 years, which suggested that Robert and James's relationship, their connection, had extended over at least that length of time, and possibly longer. In the letters, James wrote of the agony of separation, of the necessity of discretion, of the constant fear of discovery. He wrote of the beauty of music, of how Robert's compositions seemed to capture something ineffable, something that could not be expressed in words. He wrote of longing to be able to simply walk beside Robert in public, to acknowledge him, to claim him openly. But he also wrote of acceptance, of understanding that the world would never permit such things, and of gratitude for the moments they were able to steal together. Moments hidden in concert halls after hours, in hotel rooms during touring season, in the space between one performance and the next when the boundaries of ordinary life seemed momentarily to dissolve. One letter, dated 1933, contained a passage that became widely quoted in academic circles studying LGBTQ history and the experiences of marginalized identities in the early 20th century. In this letter, James wrote, "I wonder sometimes if future generations will understand what we risked. Not merely our reputations or our livelihoods, though those were at stake, but our very sense of self. To love you in the way I do, to feel this truth in every fiber of my being, and yet to be forced to hide it, to pretend, to construct an entire false life around this central secret, it is a kind of death while one is still living. And yet I would endure any amount of this suffering for the privilege of knowing you, of having loved you, of being loved by you in return. Perhaps that is the real courage. Not the grand gestures that history celebrates, but the quiet, daily choice to continue living, to continue creating beauty, to continue being human in a world that denies your humanity." These words, read aloud by Patricia at academic conferences, quoted in articles about historical trauma and resilience, seem to resonate with something fundamental in human experience. They spoke to the specific historical moment of the 1930s, certainly. But they also seem to speak to something more universal, the human need to be seen, to be known, to have one's truth acknowledged. James had written these letters, knowing almost certainly that they would never be sent, that no one would ever read them. He had written them as an act of testimony, a way of making his own experience real and valid even if no one else could ever acknowledge it. But there was more. Among the documents that emerged was a musical score. It was a composition in Robert's handwriting, dated 1931, the same year as the photograph in the wallet. The piece had no title, but in the margin in Robert's careful handwriting were two initials, J. W. James Whitmore. The composition was haunting, intricate, emotionally complex. It moved through several movements, beginning with a theme that was almost playful, almost joyful, then gradually becoming more melancholic, more introspective, building toward a moment of intense passion before resolving into a kind of resigned acceptance. It was, in many ways, a musical representation of the relationship itself. The joy of connection, the sorrow of necessary concealment, the intensity of forbidden feeling, and finally, the acceptance of reality as it was rather than as one might wish it to be. Margaret and Patricia worked with music historians to have the composition properly analyzed and performed. When it was finally premiered at a concert dedicated to Robert's work, held at the same conservatory where he had studied nearly a century earlier, the performance moved many in the audience to tears. Here was Robert's voice, speaking directly through the medium that had always been most natural to him, expressing feelings that could never be expressed in words. The composition became known as J.W. in the program notes, though Margaret and Patricia knew its true meaning. It was a love song written to a man by another man, at a moment in history when such a song could never be performed publicly, when its true meaning could never be acknowledged. And yet it had survived. Hidden in an archive, preserved through generations of silence, waiting for a moment when it could finally be heard. The discovery of these materials, the letters, the composition, the accumulated evidence of a life that had been carefully hidden, prompted a broader reassessment of Robert's entire body of work. Musicologists began to listen to his other compositions with new ears, understanding them now as products of a mind grappling with intense emotional experience, with the tension between what could be expressed and what had to remain silent. His work, previously dismissed by some critics as technically competent but emotionally restrained, began to be understood as deliberately restrained, as a form of code, a way of speaking truth in a language that could only be understood by those who knew how to listen. And then came perhaps the most surprising discovery of all. A woman named Helen Whitmorchin came forward. She was James Whitmore's great-niece, a woman in her 70s, a professor of American history at a respected university. She had seen the materials about her great-uncle published in an academic journal, and she had been moved to make contact with Margaret and Patricia. What she revealed added another layer to the story. In her possession were photographs of James Whitmore from later in his life, from the 1960s and 1970s, after Robert had died. In these photographs, James appeared diminished somehow, aged in a way that seemed to go beyond the mere passage of time. There was a sadness in his eyes that had not been present in the 1931 photograph from the wallet. Helen believed, though she could not prove it, that James had never recovered from Robert's death, that the decades of necessary secrecy had taken their toll, that the loss of the one person who had truly known him had left him fundamentally altered. Helen also shared family stories. James had never married, which had been a source of some concern to his family. They had assumed he would eventually find a wife, would settle down, would do what was expected of him. But he never did. He had devoted himself entirely to music, to his career as a conductor, to his work at various orchestras and conservatories. He had been kind, generous, beloved by his students. But he had also been marked by a kind of melancholy, a distance that his family could not quite understand. Helen's mother, James's niece, had once mentioned to Helen's father that her uncle seemed to be grieving something, that he carried a sadness that never quite lifted. Now, reading the letters, understanding the relationship with Robert, Helen understood what her great-uncle had been grieving. He had been grieving the loss of the one person who had truly known him, the one person with whom he could be fully, completely himself. Margaret and Patricia worked with Helen to create a more comprehensive exhibition, one that included not just the photograph and the letters and the musical composition, but also James Whitmore's personal effects, his photographs from later life, and Helen's family stories. The exhibition was titled Hidden in Plain Sight: The Life and Love of James Whitmore and Robert Hayes, using Robert's full name for the first time publicly. It traveled to museums and cultural institutions across the country. In every place it went, it drew large crowds, and more importantly, it prompted conversations. Families came together to see the exhibition and found themselves discussing secrets of their own, relatives who had been erased or forgotten, identities that had never been acknowledged. The wallet, the photograph, the 3 words, "My heart's truth," had become a kind of cultural touchstone, a way of speaking about the hidden histories that all families carry. But perhaps the most moving consequence of the exhibition's travels came when it was displayed at a small university in Massachusetts. A man attended the opening reception. He was elderly, in his late 80s, and he approached Margaret and Patricia with tears in his eyes. He introduced himself as Thomas. He said he had known Robert. Not intimately, not as a close friend, but he had been a student of Robert's at the conservatory in the late 1950s. Robert had been a teacher there, teaching composition and music theory to students who would go on to have their own careers in music. Thomas said that Robert had been the first person to tell him that his own emerging identity as a gay man was not shameful, was not wrong, was something to be accepted and even celebrated. Robert had never explicitly discussed his own life, had never revealed his own secret. But in the way he had treated Thomas, in the kindness and acceptance he had shown, in the implicit message that one could be a gay musician and a human being of dignity and worth, Robert had given Thomas the gift of his own survival. Thomas had gone on to have a long career in music, had been able to live openly in a way that Robert and James had never been able to do, and he had always understood that this freedom was built on the struggles of those who had come before him, those who had endured the silence and the secrecy. When Thomas finished telling his story, Patricia embraced him. And in that embrace was perhaps the most important truth about the wallet and its hidden photograph. The love between Robert and James had not been a private thing, contained entirely within their relationship. It had rippled outward, had created possibilities, had given gifts to the world even as it had been forced to hide itself. The 3 words, "My heart's truth," had not just been a declaration meant for James to read in secret. They had been a declaration of a fundamental truth about what it means to be human, to be alive, to insist on one's own existence in a world that wants to erase you. The wallet itself, now more than 90 years old, has been digitally scanned and preserved in multiple formats. Its image is available to researchers and students around the world. The photograph it contained, the letters, the musical composition, the personal papers and effects of both men, All of these materials are now publicly accessible through the archive. What had been hidden is now visible. What had been secret is now part of the historical record. And the story of Robert and James, once buried so deep that it seemed it might be lost forever, has been brought back into the light, where it belongs.